Good afternoon. This is Lorraine Bell. I am Chief Officer for Population Health here with Catholic Charities USA, and want to welcome you all for coming and attending this webinar. We have a full hour of information to share with you. Two parts to this to the webinar. We'll have an update from our Director of Policy and Government here at Catholic Charities on some of our initiatives around criminal justice reform. And we'll also have our featured presentation on the initiative to end girls' incarceration. It will be a review of national literature and best practices. This initiative is out of the Vera Institute of Justice, and we have two program staff who I will introduce as we move forward with the webinar. But first, before we get started, we have some housekeeping information that we need to share with you. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ben Wortham so he can give you that information.
Yep. Thank you, Lorraine, and welcome everybody. Just very quickly, right up on your screen, the webinar is going to be recorded, and it's going to be in the members only portal on catholiccharitiesusa.org. Your phone lines and speakers are automatically muted right now. During the webinar, feel free to use the chat feature on the right side to type your comments and questions during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, if there's time, we'll go to question and answer. If we don't have enough time, you will receive a written response to your question via email. And one more slide really quick. Thank you for those who are going after the continuing education credit today. We're offering 1 credit for this. For the continuing education credit, in the follow-up email, which will come out 24 to 48 hours after the webinar ends from the GoToWebinar system, there'll be a SurveyMonkey link along with PDF slides and a YouTube recording. In order to get the continuing education credit, just click into the SurveyMonkey link, fill out the evaluation and 10-question post-test. It takes about 3 minutes, and about 10 days or a week from today, most likely, you'll be getting your continuing education certificate, and the link to the SurveyMonkey closes 1 week from the day you receive it in your email. So if you receive the SurveyMonkey link for the evaluation and post-test tomorrow, it'll close a week from tomorrow, and then the certificates will go out either that day or the day after. So hopefully this helps, and thank you so much. I'm gonna turn it back to Lorraine. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ben. So for the first part of our time together, as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to introduce Andrew Bosjancic, who is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs here at Catholic Charities USA, and he's going to give a summary of our recent work related to criminal justice reform. You can start, Andrew.
Great, thank you, Lorraine, and thanks for everybody for jumping on today. So today I just want to talk a little bit about some of the recent initiatives that Catholic Charities USA has done around criminal justice reform. So I can start with kind of just the outline of everything that we've done on the next slide here that gives kind of the timeline of what we've seen recently. First and foremost, I think the biggest thing to talk about will be the First Step Act, which was signed into law in December 2018. And then CCUSA has done some work around what's called the REAL Act, which I'll dive a little bit more into around Pell Grant restoration for formerly incarcerated individuals. And then most recently, we've seen a lot of talk around COVID-19 aid relief, particularly for nonprofits, for vulnerable populations, particularly incarcerated individuals. And lastly, a statement of solidarity that Catholic Charities USA and our other Catholic partners put out in response to some of the work that should be done around COVID-19 aid relief for incarcerated individuals. So first up here, the First Step Act. And so essentially what this did, it made a retroactive reforms enacted by the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. It did reauthorization of the Second Chance Act, which was an Obama-era criminal justice reform revision that did a lot of good work. And so that kind of continued that work. And also it did a lot to ease mandatory minimum sentencing laws under federal law. And what CCUSA did was we worked with a lot of our partners, both Catholic and secular partners, to work with Congress to make sure that this ended up being a reality. It was a very close call, but a lot of efforts between the White House and particularly Jared Kushner was a big player in this as well. The House, the Senate, they all kind of came together right around Christmas and were able to pass this and started making those next steps. Yet we still have a far way to go as far as criminal justice reform, but this kind of continues making sure that we're getting closer to a more equitable system. So most recently, we've turned our attention to the REAL Act. And so this currently is not federal law. We're in the process of still working on trying to get this passed. So what it does essentially is it reinstates federal Pell Grant eligibility for individuals incarcerated in federal and state penal institutions and for other purposes. And so essentially what this would do is give them access to higher education at a time when they come out of being incarcerated. A lot of folks then will have that opportunity to have a college degree or be in the process of building, getting higher education to build those skills that they need when they assimilate back into society. So what our office has done, we signed on to a letter of support, and we're currently meeting with congressional staff to garner more of their support of co-sponsorship, and hopefully we'll see that in a reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act that's coming through. It's still up in the air if that's actually going to happen, with Congress kind of starting to wrap up in preparation for the upcoming election, but it's an initiative we're going to keep pursuing at this time and further on if necessary. So what we've seen recently, as all of you know, we live in a very different time at this point, and so we've done a lot for COVID-19 aid relief for incarcerated individuals. And so really what we wanted to see was making sure that one of the things we signed on to was giving folks that were formerly incarcerated access to PPP loans for their businesses. It's been set up that they wouldn't have that access if they were able to apply for a PPP loan if they had a record previously. And we wanted to make sure that folks that were formerly incarcerated, they had that same equal access that all these other businesses were able to get these loans to keep their businesses afloat at this time. And then we pushed for a lot of responses that we saw in the CARES Act, which include $100 million of emergency funding for the federal prison systems for COVID-19 response, which means making sure that there's more access for sanitary conditions, making sure that people are being socially distant, and making sure that they had other opportunities so that they're not super isolated and they had access to other needs. And the other part was offering, including free access to phone and video conferencing calls during the pandemic. This isolating time can be difficult for all individuals, but even those that are incarcerated, still trying to deal with those opportunities to stay connected to their families that they can no longer see due to COVID-19 kind of forcing folks to stop those visitation policies. So we wanted to push for that as well. And then lastly, and I linked to the letter here, we did a Catholic statement of solidarity. And essentially what we wanted to do is making sure that folks in Congress and the administration were aware of, we can't forget those that are behind bars and those that are often too forgotten, making sure that they have their needs met and making sure that they're having a voice. And, as Catholics, we're called to speak out for those behind bars and those who have the least among us. So, in quote from the letter here is, we urge our fellow Catholics to join us in standing in solidarity with our all too often forgotten brothers and sisters who are affected by incarceration and detention. And this goes beyond just what's happening in COVID-19, but beyond that, we want to make sure that we're continuing to give a voice for those that are often forgotten or often cast aside by society. So we continue to fight for them, along with U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and a lot of our other Catholic partners. And so that's kind of all I had today. So I'll turn it back over to Lorraine, and I'll let her introduce Hannah and Asia with the Vera Institute.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Just want to let everyone know that when we send out the slides for the main presentation, Andrew's slides will be connected as well, so you can have access to that. So I want to take time and talk a little bit about how this came about. I was back in December of last year, went down to New Orleans and had a visit with a group of people from the various networks who have a ministry around the reentry program. I came down there with members from CCUSA, including Jane Stenson. And from that visit and learning a lot about some of the activities that's going on in the various local agencies around reentry, came back and thought about some of the stuff that we wanted to do to continue the momentum, to provide additional education and information to that group as they continue to do their work and expand. And so Jane had asked, maybe we could think of some topics that we could bring to the network, but to the reentry folks specifically. And I thought, well, I wanted to sort of focus on some efforts around women who are incarcerated. I thought that would be something interesting. And so from my work years ago at a research and consulting company, I became aware of the Vera Institute of Justice and the work that they do. And I did some exchanges of emails with the executive director of that organization, and he put me in contact with our two presenters. But I want to just tell you that the Vera Institute of Justice is a national research and policy advocacy organization, and it's located in New York, but they, of course, have offices here in Washington, D.C. And Vera's mission is to work with others who share their vision to tackle the most pressing injustices of our day, from the causes and consequences of mass incarceration to racial disparities and the loss of public trust in law enforcement, to the unmet needs of vulnerable and marginalized and those who are harmed by crime and violence. So that's their mission. And so with that, I want to introduce our two speakers who are from the Vera Institute of Justice. Hannah Green, who is the Senior Program Office Associate with Vera's Ending Girls Incarceration team. She brings nearly a decade of policy reform and project management experience to her work. And she came to Vera with a background in philanthropy and policy. She also brings direct service experience, having worked with survivor defendants awaiting trial in New York City and survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault in hospital emergency departments. Ms. Green has a master's in social work from Columbia University. And her colleague, who also will be part of this presentation today, is Ms. Asia Bowman, who is a program associate also with Vera, and she is on the Ending Girls Incarceration team. She has background also in direct service policy research within the social service sector. And Ms. Bowman also holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Chicago. So it's with pleasure and excitement that I introduce these two ladies, and you can go forth with your presentation. We're all ears. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Lorraine, and hi everyone. It's really wonderful to be with you all today. As Lorraine said, my name is Hannah Green, and I'm a Senior Program Associate at Vera working on the initiative to end girls incarceration, and my colleague Asia Bowman is also on the line, who will be joining me and presenting to you all. So in terms of what to expect from the presentation, we really just wanted to walk you through a sense of what some of the national data, some of the national context on what tends to bring youth into contact with the juvenile justice system on the girls' side of the system, some of the racial and gender disparities that we see across the system, and then walk briefly through what the research tells us in terms of best practices for working with this population and what are some promising practices from across the country. So if you could go to the next slide. So I'm going to kick it over to Asia to walk through some of the national context, and then I will talk briefly about what our work looks like, and then we'll really dive into some of this research and end with an overview of best practices on gender responsive care. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Asia.
Great, thanks, Hannah. So like Lorraine and Hannah said, I'm Asia Bowman, and I'm a program associate with the Ending Girls Incarceration team over at the Vera Institute of Justice. I want to start off by painting a national picture as to why focusing on ending the incarceration of girls and in the LGBTQ youth is necessary and where we should be focusing. Next slide, please. When we take a look at national trends, we see that successful juvenile justice reform efforts have driven down the number of youth in custody, and it's increased our recognition that youth should not be in custody in custody except in cases where public safety is a risk. And that if youth are in custody, that it should be in the least restrictive setting as possible. But when we look at these type of reforms and services put in place, we see that girls and LGBTQ youth have largely been left out. As a result, whereas jurisdictions have multiple diversion options for boys, many have none or only one available for girls. If jurisdictions do have a diversion or alternative options available for girls and LGBTQ youth, they tend to not have been designed with gender in mind or with the unique needs of girls and LGBTQ youth. This can result in girls staying in custody longer for lower level offenses as compared to boys. Compounding this issue is the fact that gender and race contribute to who is offered diversion options when they are actually available. When we look at who is left in the system on the girl side of the juvenile justice system, we can still stay on the other slide. You can go back one. Thank you. When we look at who's left in the system on the girl side, it is disproportionately girls of color and LGBTQ youth. And so often the girls who still end up in the deepest end of this system are those with the longest, most complex trauma histories. It's these girls that other systems fail to help, and so they often end up in the juvenile justice system. But the juvenile justice system was built primarily to respond to public safety issues and is not an appropriate place to provide the type of individualized trauma-informed services and supports that the girls need to actually heal. Next slide. And when we look at the data, the best national estimates show us that 40% of youth on the girl side of the juvenile justice system are lesbian, gay, or bisexual. This is compared to just 14% on the boy side. Of course, some of this discrepancy is likely because of the underreporting that happens on the boy side, but it also speaks to the fact that there is something unique about the way that girls in particular can be criminalized when their sexuality does not conform to gendered expectations. And youth of color who identify as lesbian, bisexual, queer, transgender, and or gender nonconforming are at a particular risk for criminalization and incarceration. An overwhelming majority of the LGBTQ youth and gender nonconforming youth in the juvenile justice facilities are youth of color. They make up 85% of this population. We'll talk about this more when we talk about pathways, but sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression can serve as pathways into the juvenile justice system for youth who fail to conform to expected gender norms. For example, LGBTQ youth are at risk of family rejection, both from their birth families and foster homes, which can lead to survival offenses, or they can be arrested for bullying that takes place at school that eventually leads or essentially leads to assault charges. Throughout this presentation, we'll talk about youth on the girl side of the system, and that includes LGBTQ youth. So you may hear me refer to them as either LGBTQ youth or as gender expansive youth. But when we're talking about this, we're including that whole population. Next slide, please. Incarceration is not the solution to girls' challenges. We know that incarceration is harmful for young people. Confinement in the juvenile justice system exacerbates and compounds the traumas that we know girls and gender expansive youth are likely to have experienced before entering the system. A study shows that girls who are detained as juveniles are 5 times more likely to die from preventable causes, and that includes homicide by interpersonal violence. And when we look at race, that increases. Latina girls are 9 times more likely to die from preventable causes. And again, that includes homicide by interpersonal violence. Next slide, please. When we look at the type of charges that tend to bring girls into the system, we see that overwhelmingly girls are arrested and incarcerated for low-level offenses. Up to 80% of them have experienced sexual violence. For girls in the juvenile justice system, this violence was likely to have started earlier than for their peers not in the juvenile justice system. And for many, it starts as young as the age of 5. And up to 90% of these girls have experienced family violence. In many cases, girls are criminalized because of their response to this trauma. For instance, data shows us that Black girls are seen as needing less care than their white peers, and they are criminalized or not listened to because of their race. The myth of Black women's hypersexuality, availability, and compliance is deeply ingrained into the culture of our country and central to the racialized and gendered system of oppression that to this day perpetuates inequality in the lives of women and girls of color. Systems simply respond different to Black girls, and they are more likely to be criminalized when they do fight back, and also less likely to receive the support that they need. Next slide, please. And racial biases continue to inform decision-making. We see evidence of systemic racism and bias at every system point. The result is that girls of color, particularly Black, Native, and Latinx girls, bear the burden of incarceration across the country. And typically, the disproportionality grows the deeper we move into the system. American Indian, Native Alaskan, and Native Hawaiian girls are 51% more likely to be detained for delinquency than their white counterparts. Black girls receive more severe dispositions even after taking into account the seriousness of the offense, prior record, and age. Latinx youth are 65% more likely to be detained or placed than their white counterparts. And lack of consistency in data collection means disparities for Latinx youth are consistently underreported. Next slide. And racial disparities tend to grow as we move further into the system, and as we look at residential placements, we see some of the deepest disparities. So what this data really is showing us is the rate per 100,000 girls that are in residential placement broken down by race and ethnicity. So let's walk through this data. So what we see here is that per 100,000 white girls, there are 37 placed in residential placement. For Black girls, it's 123. For Hispanic, it's 47. For Asian girls, it's 11. And for Native Americans, it's 179. So huge disparities here. Next slide. National data shows us that these, what you see on the slide, these are the common pathways that bring youth into the girl side of the juvenile justice system. Of course, the way that this is broken down is an oversimplification. Most girls do not enter the justice system in a linear pathway, but instead are experiencing multiple overlapping pathways into the system. We find laying out the pathways in this manner to be helpful really for the purposes of like resource mapping and data collection, but it's highly important to not limit the solutions to exacerbate these silos. We don't see gender and race explicitly listed as a pathway, but we know these identities influence girls and gender expansive youth ending up in detention and placement. I'm going to walk through the pathways and give a couple of examples for each of the pathways, and many, if not all of you, have probably seen this show up in your work in one way or another. So when we're considering how gender influences these pathways, let's talk about family conflict. Let's start there. Parental expectations of girls' obedience can influence how girls are responded to. Girls' violence more commonly happens in the home versus boys, where their violence more commonly happens within the community. LGBTQ youth experience family rejection at higher rates than their cis and straight peers. And all of these factors can influence girls and gender expansive youth ending up in the juvenile justice system. We move over to the crossover pathway. When we speak about crossover youth, we're talking about youth that started off in the child welfare system, and at some point during their time with the child welfare system, simultaneously became involved with the juvenile justice system. They quite literally crossed over from child welfare into the juvenile justice system. And when we're talking about this population, a crossover population, girls are disproportionately likely to become crossover youth. They make up 25% of the juvenile justice population, but account for 47% of crossover youth. In many cases, the trauma that resulted in the child welfare involvement was also the trigger for behaviors that resulted in justice involvement. We already talked about criminalized survival. For example, when girls fight back and are acting to protect themselves. Additionally, when we look at the commercial sexual exploitation of children or trafficked youth, 94% of trafficking survivors are women and girls. And while most states have passed some form of a safe harbor legislation, girls continue to be swept into the system for related offenses, including survival offenses of shoplifting, burglary, coerced robbery, or drug trade. And keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list of the type of survival offenses that can land girls being arrested or in detention or placed. When we consider schools as a pathway, many of us are familiar with the school to prison pipeline. And it's important to note that while girls and LGBTQ youth of color experience many of the same challenges in schools as their peers, these experiences are further informed by gender. Girls of color can receive harsher punishments related to dress and hair violations, which can lead them into the entry into the juvenile justice system. We know that LGBTQ youth are more likely to experience bullying or lack of acceptance in school, and this can lead to them fighting back or behaviors that then push them into the juvenile justice system. Gender expectations of girls can also land them in the juvenile justice system. For instance, when girls do fight back, it's seen as an unacceptable behavior. But for boys, the idea is more readily acceptable that, you know, boys will be boys and if this behavior is okay, but girls are not given that same leeway. Moving on to violation of probation. This is a place where bias can show up because there is often wide discretion among probation officers in when to consider something a violation. Runaway behavior often drives violations of probation for girls, and we see this in almost all of our sites, that status offense behaviors often land girls back in detention if they run away from placement or from home while on probation. Because the juvenile justice system knows that these girls experience sexual violence or trafficking, the system may lock them up due to safety concerns. But we know that this actually does not make the girls safer. Concerns for girls' safety can lead to violations that may not have resulted in the same response for boys. And this is actually an indication that something isn't right in the home, not necessarily that the girls are a public safety risk. Majority of youth in the juvenile justice system have experienced trauma, but gender is an important factor when considering the type of violence, who inflicted the harm, how young people responded, whether or not they internalized it or externalized it, and how systems respond to these youth. So I'm going to pass it back to Hannah, and she's going to walk us through exactly how our team responds to this and what our work looks like in resolving this issue.
Great, thank you, Asia. Yeah, if you could go to the next slide, thank you. So Asia walked through some of the pathways and contexts that tend to bring youth into contact with the girls' side of the juvenile justice system, and the ways that the system is really ill-equipped to respond to girls' needs, to the traumas, to those underlying contexts that we know are driving their entry into the system. And so I'm going to pivot a little bit to just talk a little bit about what's the work that we're doing to actually disrupt these pathways. So if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So last year we announced a bold but what we think is very achievable goal, which is to end the incarceration of youth on the girls' side of the juvenile justice system within 10 years, so by 2030. And we know this is possible because the numbers tell us that confinement numbers are low enough to put this well within reach. So Asia mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that juvenile justice reform efforts have driven down custody numbers across the board. For youth in juvenile justice. And so last year there were just about 42,000 detentions of girls. And most states had fewer than 150 girls in residential placement on the last day that they did the recorded census. And many had fewer than 50. So the numbers certainly show us that this is possible. And then in the context of COVID, and I know Andrew talked a little bit about the work that y'all have been doing around COVID and making sure that conditions are safe for folks who are incarcerated, and that incarcerated people are not being left behind during this crisis. And what we've seen systems do is actually respond really rapidly. They're having to more directly confront the harms of unnecessarily incarcerating young people. And so numbers have actually declined even more significantly across all of the sites that we work in. And I expect that if we were to look nationally, that we'd see numbers are down pretty significantly also. So if you could go to the next slide. So our strategy to get to zero is really three-pronged. The first place that we start is we really want to target the top incarcerators of girls. So there's 8 states across the country that together account for over 50% of the number of girls in residential placement. These are not states that are necessarily disproportionately incarcerating youth on the girls' side. They're typically the states with the largest population. So these are states like California, Texas, New York, Florida. States with large populations. And so we want to target some work in those states so that if we can drive down numbers there, we can have a really significant impact over national numbers in general. And then the second prong is actually to target the lowest incarcerators. So there are 9 states that had fewer than 30 girls in residential placement on the last day of the most recent residential census. And so we're trying to work with some of those states so that we can get to zero quickly, kind of show that this is possible, that it's possible to get at and stay at zero. And then the last prong of this approach is really to pilot and incubate solutions. We know there are some common challenges that jurisdictions face. The pathways that Asia walked you all through are present across everywhere that we work. And as she said, I'm sure that you all have seen some of these challenges in the work that you all do on the ground. And part of what we see, and where I'm gonna go next, is that there's really a lack of evidence in terms of looking at what works for girls and for LGBTQ youth. And so part of what we want to do is really help build up that evidence base and build on what already exists to show what can work. So next slide, please. So right now we're working in 5 places across the country. We started our work in New York in 2017, and in 2018 we expanded to 4 new sites. So Maine, North Dakota, Hawaii, and then Santa Clara County in California. Since we've started our work in New York, we've seen a nearly 70% decline in the number of girls in detention. And since starting in Santa Clara, we've seen numbers are down just about 40% as compared to last year. And this is pre-COVID, so numbers are actually down a little bit more post-COVID. So if you go to the next slide, I will talk quickly about what our work looks like. Obviously, the places that we're working are really geographically disparate, they're varied. And we did that on purpose because we wanted to work with sites that had different populations of girls who are most marginalized, that were experiencing different challenges, whether that's urban or rural contexts, whether that's different access to resources or cultural histories or cultural contexts. And so we wanted to have a really varied group of sites to be working with. So the work looks different in all of those places because the places are really different, but we typically have some similar components or types of processes that we do. So first and foremost, the work is data-driven. Our process is really collaborative and based in data. What we find often when we go into sites is that government is, they're in a position where they're ready to start making some changes, but they're not really sure how. And they don't really know how to meaningfully incorporate community voice or youth voice at the table. And so that's really where we come in. We support government in better understanding the importance of focusing on girls and LGBTQ youth of color. We get them to commit to zero. We walk through a lot of the same data that we just shared with you all on why it's important to focus on this population and what some of those underlying drivers are that are bringing youth into contact with the girls' side of the system. And to get there, we analyze and share data and information. We want to see what's happening locally on the ground. So which of those pathways that Asia walked through are most salient, what combinations of pathways or contexts are really driving incarceration at a local level. And then we help them work collaboratively across agencies. So bringing together not only correctional folks, juvenile justice folks, but also preventive agencies. So child welfare systems, education, mental and behavioral health, housing, child welfare, to make sure that those leaders are at the table to think about how we can actually prevent contact with the juvenile justice system or better respond if girls are arrested. And then we also bring local community advocates, youth leaders to the table to build partnership, to make sure that their voices are really leading and driving this process so that the solutions that we're thinking about can work. And then we work to just design, execute, and evaluate the different solutions that we are piloting on the ground. So where we are now in the work is we've completed a diagnostic assessment with each of our sites. We have a sense of what's driving entry into the justice system at a local level, and now we're in the process of really developing and implementing solutions, which is a really exciting place to be. So if you could go to the next slide. Can you go to the next slide, Mary?
Sorry, Hannah, we're frozen right now. Let me.
Oh, no worries.
Jesus.
I can keep talking while you figure out the tech side of things. What will be on the next slide, but I will preview for you, there you go, is an overview of what we define as ending incarceration. So what we talk about is actually getting to zero. We have a purposely broad definition of ending incarceration, and we hold our sites to high standards for actually getting to zero. So our definition includes any mandated out-of-home placement as a result of justice system involvement. And we're really clear with our sites about avoiding types of technical fixes that might get sites to zero. They might be able to close units in their juvenile justice facilities, but they haven't necessarily addressed those underlying conditions that we talked about that really drive girls' entry into the system. And that's really where we're focused, is changing the environment, changing the pathways, disrupting those pathways so that girls are meaningfully better off in their communities. So for example, we wouldn't consider it enough to simply transfer all the youth from the girls' side of the juvenile justice system to psychiatric mental health facilities. While we know that many youth in juvenile justice and many youth on the girls' side have mental health needs, not all of them rise to the level of needing residential care. And these decisions should really be made according to a medical standard, not as a consequence of justice involvement. So we don't support solutions that are based solely on just building a new residential mental health facility, for example. And similarly, we can't just forget about girls who have been moved to other parts of the system. So we wouldn't consider a site at zero if they transferred many of their girls to the adult side of the system, or moved girls to out-of-state facilities, even if they were able to close their units in state. And then lastly, we don't consider it a solution to simply place everyone on electronic monitoring. Again, this isn't actively addressing those underlying factors or pathways that Asia walked through. So next slide, please. So the types of things that we are talking about, great. The types of things that we are talking about are solutions and recommendations that actually advance girls' rights to safety, education, healthcare, housing. And one of the key things that we see across our sites, and Asia mentioned this before, is that girls are typically not experiencing one linear pathway into confinement, right? There's multiple drivers, multiple contexts that are driving this contact. And so siloed solutions will not be enough to address the needs of girls and LGBTQ youth who are still slipping through the cracks. So we're encouraging systems to think holistically about how they can work together. So for example, in Santa Clara County, where we work, we see a high number of girls getting admitted to detention because they can't go home. So the offenses aren't necessarily really serious, but once they are coming into contact with police, either their parents are refusing to take them back, they're refusing to go home, parents can't be located, there might be domestic violence or family violence happening in the home. And so the solutions that we're talking about right now are really a combination of things, a combination of beefing up family finding practices, expanding respite options, thinking about parent coaches in both child welfare and probation, changing practices and policies in arrest and screening. So one of those things is not going to be enough, but we really need to be thinking holistically and making sure that systems are working together to be accountable to young people. And then on the programming side of things, we're really looking to center programming that's empowering, supporting young people in their communities, and again, addressing those underlying factors that are often bringing them into contact with the system. So if you go to the next slide, I'll start talking a little bit more about what that means in terms of programming. So I mentioned earlier that one of the critical pieces of our work is really to support the development of an evidence base around what can work for girls and LGBTQ youth. And that's because unfortunately there's not a ton of research or evidence out there around what does work for this population. What we do know from the research is that gender neutral programming is significantly less effective for girls. So we recently partnered with some colleagues of ours at New York University to do a literature review. And what their meta-analysis found was that there's a few elements that are most promising in terms of working for girls. And so those are what's on the slide, and I'll just walk through a couple of things that I'd like to highlight. First, when we're talking about restorative, not only thinking about restorative justice, but also about programming that's really centering healing. And what we see is that when we talk to girls and LGBTQ youth, what they often disclose is not only that they've experienced abuse or violence, particularly sexual abuse, as Asia mentioned, but also that public systems were complicit in either perpetuating that abuse or failing to respond to that abuse in a way that they felt was meaningful. A lot of times systems have pathologized or blamed them for the responses that they've had to violence that they've experienced. And so programming for girls is most effective when it creates space to acknowledge those harms and actually supports them in developing the skills that they need to navigate systems that have harmed them in the past. The second thing I'd highlight is this socio-culturally anchored. So this is really just talking about the importance of cultural competence. And many of you may be familiar with the term intersectionality. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor. But really the idea here is just to describe the compounding and overlapping marginalization that people experience based on their race, sex, gender, class, sexuality. and other identities. So programming that's centered, solely on looking at the impacts of gender, but isn't taking into account girls' race and the racism that they may have experienced is just going to be less effective. And then the last thing that I'll highlight is multi-level. A lot of the gold standard evidence-based interventions for justice-involved youth are focused at the family level. So they're really looking to change a young person's behavior by changing the way that a young person's family communicates and operates. And family is certainly a very important component when we're talking about healing and addressing some of the harms that have led girls into the system. But we also know that for many of the youth deepest in the system on the girls' side, they may be disconnected from family. Their family may not be able to actively participate in or willing to participate in programming. And this can end up harming girls, and they can end up back in the system because families were not able to participate in some of these more intensive interventions. And so effective gender responsive programming needs to be able to target multiple systems, but keeping the needs of the girl really central, and thinking about whether it's a goal for her to be reconnected and receiving family therapy, for example. So if you go to the next slide, really quickly, a lot of times programs will take interventions that were designed for boys and just change some of the imagery, change some of the visuals and the program materials, maybe make them pink, and then offer that to girls. And so, we just want to remember that girls are not just smaller, pinker versions of boys. And also that many of the youth who are in the juvenile justice system or in the foster care systems are there actually because they're breaking gender norms. And so it's really important that programming is able to attend to the ways that those gendered and racialized experiences have actually impacted their trajectory into the juvenile justice system. And again, if you remember from the previous slide, gender neutral programming. So we would consider this gender neutral programming if it's something that was kind of designed without gender in mind and then just made pink to be offered to girls, is just less effective for girls. So if you go to the next slide, I want to walk through one framework or approach to programming that we are working on across our sites, and that's what we're calling an advocacy-based approach. So as opposed to a traditional medical model, which would position a doctor or a counselor as an expert, it would typically require a diagnosis, especially if you're going to be billing, would focus primarily on behavioral modification. Advocacy-based approaches position young people, position girls and LGBTQ youth as experts in their own lives, pairs them with advocates who work alongside them as they develop the tools and skills they need to work towards self-identified goals and actually change their environmental contexts. So what we know from literature is that about 50% of the variance in delinquent behavior in young people is accounted for by personal characteristics and direct environment. So those are kind of individual pieces. But that remaining 50% of variance is due to structural or societal factors. So while it's important to focus on individual behavior, it is equally important to focus on some of these structural challenges that young people are facing as well. And this is where the advocacy model can really help. I mentioned before that there's a lack of evidence in terms of programming on what's effective for girls and LGBTQ youth, but there's a growing body of evidence in this area. And what research has found is that these traditional evidence-based programs, MST, FFT, MDFT, are actually less effective for girls. And recent studies looking at advocacy-based interventions have shown really promising results. So after working with an advocate, girls are 5 times less likely to engage in delinquent behavior. They're less likely to get in trouble in school, engage in risky behaviors, use substances. And we also see reductions in those traditional mental health outcomes that we want to see, also reductions in anxiety and depression. This is certainly not to say that these traditional modalities of treatment are not necessary or effective, right? In many cases, they are needed and necessary, but also just points to an alternative approach that can help fill some of the gaps that we know are still pushing girls and LGBTQ youth into the system. So if you go to the next slide, I will talk through a little bit more about some of the touchstones of advocacy-based programs. So these types of interventions actually emerged within the field of intimate partner violence, and they're now spreading to other fields, including juvenile justice. So the 3 touchstones that are key for advocacy-based programs, the first is accountability, and this is really about shifting concepts of accountability. So shifting the idea of accountability from the girl who is engaging in the program to the program. So if something isn't working, if something is failing, rather than saying, oh, labeling someone as non-compliant, to really be thinking about how can the program shift to support this young person in the best way possible. The second piece is self-determination. We know that people experience greater well-being when they have greater control over their lives. But we also know that youth in particular often lack decision-making control over really key areas of their lives, and this is especially true for justice-involved youth. So in advocacy-based programming, the idea is to really give decision-making authority over the focus and direction of the interventions to be driven by the girls who are being served. And this is a cornerstone of trauma-informed care as well, because it's creating opportunities for control, for choice, to take back some of that control that gets taken away when people experience trauma, particularly sexual violence. And then the last piece is really around reimagining girls' needs and wants as experiences to which they have a right. So for example, talking to girls about a desire to be able to go to school and be free from harm at school is a desire, but if we can reimagine that as something to which they are entitled to and have a right to, and then help them advocate with their school or with systems to make sure that they're able to access that right. Again, it's kind of a little bit of a flip in terms of how we often think about the role of programming. And what we see in research is that programs that incorporate all three of these touchstones are 4 times more effective for girls than programs that don't. And programs that even just incorporate one of these touchstones into their programming are still more effective for girls. So then if you go to the next slide, I just want to talk through kind of an overview of what we think are some effective key components to a full continuum of gender responsive programming. So I flagged this advocacy-based programming piece, but there's other pieces that we think are important as well. One is this social justice and collective leadership as healing. So really creating opportunities for sisterhood, for siblinghood, opportunities to practice social justice work as a form of healing can be really powerful for young people. If you remember before, I talked about the ways that girls and LGBTQ youth often talk about systems as being complicit in some of the harm that they have experienced. And so offering opportunities for them to build collective power with other young people and actually work towards social justice outcomes can be really an effective form of healing. And then looking at economic justice, so often the drivers of the behaviors that we see that land girls and LGBTQ youth in the system are driven by 2 main factors. There's relational pieces to it and there's economic factors to it. And so programming that can address both of those needs is just more effective. So programming that provides stipends or access to economic opportunities will be more effective. And then any opportunity that gives young people access to peer-based supports can also strengthen programming. And actually some of the programs that we work with create career pathways so that young people who have started in being involved in programming then can have an opportunity to start mentoring other young people who might come in, but then also sets them up on a career path to become to work in this field or even to work in that program. And so again, that's addressing the relational piece and the economic piece and providing access to some peer-based supports. So if you go to the next slide, and this is my last slide, so hopefully we'll have a good time for questions. I just wanted to highlight 3 program models. There are a number of programs across the country that are working within this framework that I talked about that have 1 or 2 or all 3 of those touchstones. But these are just 3 that we would highlight that we partner with pretty closely in some of our sites. So Soul Sisters Leadership Collective is an organization based out of Florida. They also recently expanded into New York. Young Women's Freedom Center is a program based out in California. They started in Oakland. They're now all across the state. And Roses is a program that was actually piloted out of New York University and works with justice-involved girls and gender-expansive youth in New York. And all of these programs have a lot of those, have all of those touchstones that we talked about. So stipends for participating in programming, which can be really key just for showing up. They'll provide stipends. again, to address both those relational and economic drivers. Two of them, Rose's does this to some varying degrees, really have an emphasis on social justice as healing, exposure to pathways to careers in organizing and social justice. And then what all three of them really hold core is this idea of positioning girls as experts in their own lives, working with them to identify what their goals are, and then helping them figure out how to navigate systems, how to navigate resources, how to access resources to improve their environments and to achieve their goals. So with that, I'm going to stop. And if you go to the next slide, this just has our contact information if you all have further questions after this, or you want to reach out to us to learn more, or just to have another conversation, we would love that. But I will see what questions you all have.
Hannah and Asia, thank you so much thank you so much for your presentation, for this information. It was very, very, very informative and interesting. And I know that Mary has gotten some questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask her if she can lead that and pose some questions to you.
Absolutely. Here's one. When you build partnerships with state agencies, is there an MOU or funding to support the agencies?
That's a great question. So right now we have private funding to support this work, and so we are able to provide our technical assistance free of charge to agencies. We do have an MOU that we enter into with the agencies that we work with on the ground. One thing that we are exploring, particularly in the context of COVID right now, we're seeing budget cuts, and we know that girls of color, young people who are most marginalized, are often programming and services for those people, especially formerly incarcerated youth, are the first things to get cut. And so part of what we are exploring now is if there's a way to build through some incentive funding for government so that we can actually ask them to match some funding to invest in programming. But I will say, you know, a lot of the changes that we made in New York, we actually made without significant investment. So simply by having system partners focus on this population for the first time, knowing that there's some oversight, that someone's looking at the policies and practices that they're doing, can lead to significant reductions. So that 70% reduction that we saw in New York actually happened without any additional investment. Now we're at a place where the city has invested $2.4 million over 3 years in the city's first gender responsive diversion program, which is great. And so we think we can drive down numbers even more significantly. But there are some changes to policy and practice that can be made without some additional investment, although of course, investment and funding is key to moving some of this forward. So hopefully that was an answer to that question.
Thank you. Here's another question. What are the next states on your list to work with?
Asia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I will. So we haven't identified our next states yet, but we are, as a team, discussing how we want to go about identifying those states. So within the next year, we are looking to expand into other sites, but we haven't identified the next states, though, you know, to keep in mind when we're thinking about our strategy of targeting the top 8 incarcerators and the bottom incarcerators, we definitely want to make sure that they are part of the next cohort that we decide to work with.
And I would just add, you know, so for this initial round of expansion, we had a competitive RFP process. So we kind of opened up our application and saw who would apply to work with us. And so we're still deciding if we're going to have another round of an RFP or if we're going to target states in particular. But if we do an RFP, we will definitely be sharing far and wide. So if any of you work in states where you think that this work could be brought, where you think there's fertile ground, where you think, you know, we'd love to have a conversation with you. So please do reach out if that's the case.
Thank you. I have another question. Do you know the number of girls who've been supported or avoided incarceration due to these efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way that we're able to track impact is on reductions in custody numbers. So, in New York, we saw the 70% reduction. In Santa Clara, we saw 40% reduction. I think what that doesn't fully capture is when you open programming up that is aimed at supporting girls who are in the deepest end of the system, you actually end up serving a way broader number of girls, right? This is any youth who were at risk of entering the juvenile justice system. And so we think that the impact is certainly broader than those simple reductions, but in terms of what we're tracking and to get to our goal, we're tracking those reductions in custody. Our partner organizations, so those community-based organizations that are working on the ground in each of our sites, serve large numbers of girls. Some of those are girls who would have entered the justice system. Some of them are not. And so it does become a little bit difficult to track the full scope, but we typically look just at the custody reduction numbers.
Thank you. Is there a similar effort to end the incarceration of boys?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, two things. So one is that when we look just overall at the history of juvenile justice reform, we see that most of the policies and practices that have been put in place are actually aimed and designed for boys. And so when we look at the reductions that have happened since the 90s, right, when we had that spike in juvenile justice populations, that was, super predator time, fears of violent girls. But a lot of that narrative was racialized and gendered, right? Looking at young men of color and boys of color in particular. Since that peak, we've seen really significant declines in the juvenile justice system, and boys' numbers have actually declined more significantly than girls, because a lot of the interventions were put in place and were designed for boys. So while we have not launched an initiative, there are a number of initiatives. There's, for example, Youth First has an initiative right now to close youth prisons. So there are some efforts looking at trying to end incarceration for youth. And I think what we see as really important about our work is centering a group of people who are otherwise not centered or thought about when we're looking at juvenile justice reform, but B, everyone has a gender. Boys have gender, and we know that masculinity and conceptions around masculinity drive boys' entry into the justice system as well. And so thinking about starting with this smaller population, this more vulnerable population, a population that is most marginalized in the system, building out interventions and policies and programs that can work for them. We really see that as kind of a first step to then building towards, a future where we've zeroed out youth incarceration in general. It's like the curb cutting effect, right? When they put curbs in, when they put the ramps on curbs for folks who were in wheelchairs, it actually was helpful for a really wide group of people, including, for example, moms with strollers, other people who had difficulty walking. And so we see our work as a curb cutting effect, where we can start here and then hopefully grow to serve boys as well.
Thank you. We have one last question. Are there any policy efforts on the national level?
That's a great question. We have not been working at the national level yet. What we see is that juvenile justice systems are really driven by and regulated by state and local control. And so a lot of our efforts have been focused at the state and local level. But when we're thinking about some of the interventions and programs that we're trying to put in place, we are seeing that there might be some restrictions that we're running into at the federal level in terms of funding. So these are things on the runaway and homeless youth side of things, on the child welfare side of things. And so it's something that we're certainly hoping to and looking to expand into as we move forward. But for now, most of our work has been at the state and local level. But that's a great question and somewhere we hope to grow.
Looks like we are at the hour. Got everything in, got the questions in. Wonderful presentation, wonderful, great information. Thank you so much for this. To everyone, as Ben said in the beginning, you can look out for the next 48 hours. You'll get a recording of this presentation, the slides itself, and you'll get an evaluation as well as the test if you're interested in earning your CEC. go ahead and do the test and evaluation, send it back, and then in about a week or 10 days, you'll get your certificate for participation. You'll get your credit. So with that in mind, Asia, Hannah, and Andrew, I want to say thank you so much for giving us your time and this information and this wonderful presentation. And to the network, take care, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you so much.